So it's lesson 2 of Intro to Web Programming. We're going to start putting our application together. I'm not much of an artist, as you can see. This is about as good of a diagram as I can do. Here's how this process kind of works. We basically are going to need 3 things in order to be able to get information from our users on a web page and then store it. We're going to need a database. Well, we have one of these, and we've got a few options. If you're using Azure for hosting, you can create a MySQL database on Azure. We'll show you how to do that. If you're using your AWS account, well, we've already created one for you. So you have a database on AWS. The database name is GC and your student number. So we'll look at that. Or we can create it on our local server. If we've installed XAMPP, we can start up our local server. That's probably the fastest thing, and just run our files with a local database. So we need some kind of container here, and we're going to have to build a table in our database. And I know everybody's in a probably everyone's in a relational database class as well. So you're starting to look at how to build a database and work with it. So some of those skills are going to come in handy today. So we're going to need to build a table in our database. And then we're going to need to be able to build a couple of web pages. Now, it's possible to do this with one PHP file. I find it's actually kind of confusing to do it in one file. It's actually simpler if we have 2 separate pages. One page to collect and check the user data, and then a separate page that will do some more checking and then connect and save it into the database. So it is possible to do with one file where it does both the collection and the saving. But we need a whole bunch of logic, because when the page loads, we need to know, are we asking the user for data, or did we already get the data and now we have to save it? So I like to kind of break this up into 2 separate files. I think the code is just a little bit easier to understand that way. So what we're going to use, the mechanism we're going to use for collecting data is going to be, we actually could use just an HTML only page, but eventually we'll want PHP on it, so I'm going to give it a PHP extension. We're going to use an HTML form. So we use forms whenever we're collecting any kind of data from users. So if you're on Facebook, you're updating your status, well, there's a HTML form tag there. Okay. If you're submitting an assignment on Blackboard, well, there's an HTML form there. That is the only way we have to capture data from users in a browser, is with a form. The form is invisible. It's kind of like an invisible container. And then we've got 2 methods. What we have to do is take that form, take the data from the user's browser, and we need that information sent to the web server. So there's 2 methods we can use to submit a form to the web server. Anybody know what those 2 methods are? You? You got it. So we can do post, or we can do get. Now there's something kind of strange about post and get. Which one of these is the default? So if we build a form and we don't specify a method attribute in our form, if we leave that out, which is the default? Will our form submit with post, or will our form submit with get? And post. Get is actually the default. So if we don't specify any method, we use get. Which method do we actually use 99% of the time when we're submitting forms? We actually use post almost all the time. So one of the common mistakes developers make when they're first learning to build HTML forms, and we're all going to do it, I'm still going to do it, is we build a form, we forget to include the method attribute, and then our form uses get. So we always want to make sure when we use a form that we'll do a post. Pretty much the only time get is used, the only time you ever see it, is on search forms, when we give someone an input and they can search. So we'll look a little bit more at the difference later, but this is just something to keep in mind. So we're going to use post for our form. So we've basically got 2 pages. So this is our kind of our collection page. Kind of think about it like if you're in the grocery store, you have a grocery cart, right? Your form is like the grocery cart. It holds all of the stuff we want. Okay. And then over here, we're going to have a page, a separate PHP page that's going to, in effect, catch the form and process all the inputs by saving them to the database. That second page is kind of like the checkout counter at the grocery store. Right? It checks everything we want. It does all the processing, tells us the price, and then lets us leave the store. Right? So that's kind of what this second page is going to do. So we'll sort of work with a form simply. We'll maybe do and just look at how these two pages interact together first, and then we'll add in the database part later. So first, let's get two pages talking to each other, where one form can submit data to the other and the other form can at least show us what got entered. And then we'll think about, okay, well then how do we, once we've captured that data, how do we actually stick it into a database? So we'll do that as well. Okay. So I'm going to start up, first of all, XAMPP control panel, and make sure that I start both my Apache server, so that's my web server, and I'm going to start my database server as well. These other things I don't need. I just need my database server and my MySQL server running. So if you've installed XAMPP on your machine, make sure that you start those two services. We're going to need them. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to run my files locally because as we talked about last week, it's faster than constantly uploading every change to the server. If you don't have a local server installed, I'll also remind you how to put your files up on the web server so you can load them from there. Generally, it's going to be much faster in class. I've put the links on Blackboard to install this local server. If you don't have it, I strongly recommend you install it. It will save you a lot of time and allow you to keep up more easily in class. I believe the link for this is in Weekly Learning under Tools, Links, Tools, and Resources. Yeah, so there's the link. So I would recommend installing XAMPP. It will run on a Mac, it will run on Linux, it'll run on Windows. So all of our files, if you have XAMPP installed, all of the files live inside of your XAMPP htdocs directory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new folder, and then I'm going to just keep all of the web pages we build in class in that one folder. I'm not going to make a new folder each week. We'll just continually add on to it every week. So we said we were going to make a little restaurant website. So I'm going to make a new folder. And maybe I'll call this, we'll call our application. I'll call it Barry Eats, and we'll make a list of restaurants in class like here in Barry. Okay, so we can add, list, edit, delete. And so today we'll start adding restaurants into our database. So I'm going to open up this file in my code editor. So my folder is blank. So I'm going to open it up in PHP Storm or Visual Studio Code or whatever HTML editor or PHP editor you guys prefer to use. So I created that file, and I'll just open it up. I'll just go into my XAMPP htdocs, and here's my Barry Eats folder. You can call yours anything you like. You don't have to use the same name as me. So I'll open up this folder. It loads pretty quickly because there's no files to load. It's empty. So our first, before we get into actually saving the data, let's just kind of look at how our form works. So we'll just build a sample form and then a sample page that receives that form post. So I'll just right click on my folder and choose new PHP file. And I'll maybe just call this one form. There is one thing I want to do. I'm gonna modify my PHP Storm. I'll probably delete and recreate this. Notice when I create a PHP file, it gives me a PHP tag and some comments, but it doesn't give me any HTML templating. Whereas if I do this, if I say file and new HTML file, it will actually give me like a header, title, and body tags. So what I want to do is copy, I'll just second. Notice when I create HTML, it gives me all of this code in here. I want this template to also be used when we create a new PHP file. So we don't have to type this every time. Let's see if I could make my font a little bigger here. So here's what I'm going to do. If you want to follow along with me, create an HTML file. We're not actually going to use this page. We just want to use the HTML template contents that are in here. So create an HTML file. You can name it anything you like. So you just have to right-click your folder, say new HTML file, and give it a name. And it will then open up a new file with a template. So what we want to do is copy all of this HTML. So we'll copy that. I'm actually going to delete my form test because I'm going to make it, I'm going to set up the PHP template I want, and then I'll recreate the file. Actually, I'll get rid of this. And now if I right click and say new, and if I go down to edit file templates, this is going to let us edit the template for a PHP file. So all our PHP files will now have the HTML starter text we want. So click on edit file template. And if I click on PHP, notice here's the template here. I'll delete that. And we'll just paste in our HTML. So now every time we create a new PHP file, it will start with this. Now, if you're working in Visual Studio Code, then it's probably a little different. You may not have this. This is if you're working in PHP Store. So I'll say OK. I can get rid of my HTML file now. We don't need it. We're not going to build any HTML files in this class. So I'll delete it. Now I'm back to an empty directory. Now I'm going to recreate my form test, and it should have all the HTML content already set up. So now if I check new PHP file, choose form test, rather than getting just a PHP comment, I now have my HTML template set up that we want. You don't have to do this. This is just going to save us time creating new PHP files. Can't create a file, you get an error. By default, what may have happened is, notice up here, here's my folder at the top. It's closed up. I have to click on it, and that expands it, and then I can see the file underneath. See if you can expand your folder. If you have any trouble with the templates, that's fine. You don't have to use the templates. You can just put in any HTML you like on the file. It's not critical. It just saves some time to set up the template this way. Okay. So you right-click your folder and choose New. And I went down to Edit File Templates. So I clicked on first all you have to do is click on HTML, and you can just copy the contents here. And then click on PHP file, delete the PHP template, paste it in. So then the PHP template is now the same as the HTML template. So every time you say new PHP file, it will start with this HTML content. That's probably a little easier than the way I showed the first time. Okay. So I'm just going to change this one. The title, I'll say form test. If you don't have all this HTML on here, it's okay. We're really concerned with the form part of this. Let's create a form. For starters, we'll just leave the method out. But there is one other attribute. So typically we create forms, there's two attributes we're always going to want. Method, and what's the other one? Right. And what does the action do? Right, it's saying when we submit this form, what is the next page that loads, that basically receives or catches the form post? So we don't have one right now. Now, if we leave it out, it will post to itself. That's the idea, that we have one page for capturing and processing the input. Remember, I said my preference is that we have two pages instead. We'll break the collection of the data and the processing of the data into two files. So we'll submit this to another page that we'll have to create. Maybe we'll just call this process form.php. Now, most code editors will automatically close the form tag right there. We need to make sure, a very common mistake is now to go like this and start putting in our form inputs outside of the form. And when you do that, when your form just won't submit, it won't give you any errors, but users will fill it out and click submit and nothing happens. I'll simulate that in a bit. So we want to make sure that all our inputs go here inside the opening and closing tag. Otherwise, remember I said this is like our shopping cart. If the form tags, if the inputs are outside, it's kind of like going grocery shopping, taking a cart and dropping all your food on the floor rather than putting it in the cart. It doesn't get captured if it doesn't go inside the cart. So we'll just organize it with the field set tags. And then we'll maybe have a label or so we'll put on a label. Now, I haven't specified a type attribute for my input. If we don't specify the type, what will that input look like? What kind of input do we get if we don't specify type? Yeah, just a single line text box. So I'll maybe put on two more fields. Do one more for email. So we'll have three text boxes on our form. We'll put on a button. So we're not actually putting any PHP on this page. We could use just an HTML extension. Our form doesn't really require server-side code right now, but it might later, so we're best to give it a PHP extension right now. Maybe we want to include something like a drop-down list. That list is going to be filled from choices in our database. We'll do this in a few weeks. Well, if we're going to write a database query for part of our form, we need PHP code, so the extension needs to be PHP, not HTML. So now I'm going to go to my browser and view my form on my localhost server. I'll go to localhost. On my machine, I set up XAMPP to run on port 800. If you just installed the default, you don't need any port number. It will run on port 80, which is your default HTTP port. We'll go to COMP1006. Here's my directory, and so here's what our form looks like. So 3 text boxes and a button. Now, what will happen if what will happen if I click submit here? What do you expect should happen? Well, nothing. But could guess, why does this happen? Why do we get a 404 error? You got it, right? Remember, our action is processForm.php. We're trying to load a page that doesn't exist. So right now, it throws a 404 error. That's what should happen. So if we create this file, even if there's no code in it at all, that'll make the error go away. So our next step is we need to create the second page. We need to create a file. Doesn't really matter what we call it, but whatever we specify in this action attribute, we have to create a file with that exact name. So I'll make another PHP page here. New PHP file. I'll call this process form. No need to specify the extension. My code editor will automatically give it the .php extension if I pick new PHP file. So if I just hit refresh here, right, my 404 error goes away. There's nothing happening on this page, but at least it's loading now. Now, who in class does not have a local web server installed and needs to run everything online? Anybody? FileZilla is not a web server. FileZilla is an FTP transfer program. This is a server. Do you have a local host server or no? Okay, so in that case, you'll need to upload your file, connect to, are you using Azure or AWS? Okay. So I'm going to show you how to run this on Azure or how to run it on AWS. But like I said, in class, you're probably well served to, it's a good idea to install this program. It's free, it's not very big, and that way you can just run your files locally in class. Your assignments will put on Azure or AWS, but in class, faster to use our local server. Okay, first, if you need to run this on AWS, and this is what you'll have to do for your assignment. So I'll upload my files to AWS as well. So I'll go into FileZilla. My connection to AWS is already saved. So I'll just open it up. We will get rid of this. We just have to renew the SSL certificate. It expired. So if you get this warning on AWS, just say, okay, yes, I trust the certificate. And if we go into the public HTML, so I'm just going to go in here. Here's my Barry Eats. I'll just drag my folder. And now I should be able to also load this from my AWS account. So I go to AWS, computer studies, little tilde character, and then GC and your student number. And now I should be able to do here's my form. So it's now running both on my local host as well as on AWS. If you're using Azure, then you'll need to upload the folder the same way to Azure, okay? So either one of these will work. So now I want to come back to this post and get. Remember, in our form, we didn't specify post or get. If we look at the process page, we can tell this uses get. What's the difference between using post and using get, and why do we use post much more than we use get? We can actually tell that this form submission used get. How can you tell if you look at the screen? What's the difference between post and get? Right, when we use get, all of the values from our form get added on to the end of the URL, right? We have a question mark, and this section here that is all the form values is called the query string, right? It's parameters that are passed on to our URL. So when we have get, which is our default, we get those. If we add our method here, post, try this again, all the form inputs are still going to get submitted to the next page, but we're not going to see those values in our address bar. I just added this, method equals post. So if I refresh my form now and submit, notice all of those values are no longer there. So most of the time, 99% of our forms are going to use post. Why do you suppose post is so much more common than get, based on what we just looked at? Why don't we just use get all the time? Less typing. Well, in this case, both of them are still submitting the data to the server. So it doesn't matter. We can still submit to the server with get. What if this was a login form where we're asking for a username and a password? Do you want to use post or do you want to use get? Why do we want to use post? Right, because all of the input values the user put in show up in the address browser, which also means it will show up in the browser history if someone else comes and looks at the browser. Any inputs the user has entered will be seen in the browser history. Right? So for security, this is much, much more secure. So very rarely do we actually use get. The only time we use get would be a scenario like this. This is about the only example of when we'll see get, when we're doing searches. In this case, it's a get, because there are the keywords I search for, PHP and MySQL. And if you do a search on almost any website, the form will use get. Let's go here. Say we want to search for news about it's not very fast. Right here again, there's our search term. So most websites will use get when people are searching and post for every other form. This is almost the only scenario where we'll see get used in forms, right? Because post is just safer and more private. But again, when I didn't specify anything here, it runs get. So we always want to remember that we have to specify post, that this is still our default if we leave out the method. Okay. So now on our form, our process page, anybody have any questions about our form? We're pretty much done with it for now. We want to move on to look at how do we use PHP to interpret and work with the values that users give us in our form. Any questions about the form as we've got it so far? You don't have to take pictures of the code. I put all the code on GitHub every class. And you want to follow along as best you can, but my code will be on GitHub for you to reference. Okay. That's a good question. I'm not sure I understand really why. I'm not sure I see the benefit in particular of using get at all anymore, to be honest with you. But it's still common practice, as you saw, right? And if you search on virtually any other website, you're probably going to see that search term as part of the address bar. I don't have a good answer as to why, to be perfectly honest.
Like if we go on Amazon, we are searching for a particular product and we don't buy it and we just forget to save it. We can go to our history and check the particular keywords and go to that.
That's actually a good. That's actually a very good possibility. That makes some sense as to why the value is. Right? I was searching for something today and I want to come back and run it again. I can just find that in my history. So I guess that's one benefit, doing it that way. The other thing, I guess I've used it before this way, is if we want to keep the existing results up, but we want to manipulate them, like we want to page through them or sort them, if I change this, we'll see if that affects the URL. It might add this parameter of what I pick into the URL. Let's see. Yeah, so that's a common reason. So notice now it's added. So it wanted to keep the existing parameter I searched for, but now it's adding additional parameters such as how do I want to sort the data? So I guess the answer, that would be part of the other answer, is it's related to being able to keep a certain set of data we already searched for and then manipulate it, filter it, sort it, or do other, or page through it, right? We've got 580 results here. So I suspect if I go to my next page, we'll see yet another parameter get appended on to the URL. Yeah, page equals 2 now. So that's typically why we'll see it. So somebody can move through search results in some kind of way, and it keeps track of where they are and how they're looking at the data. So that's pretty much the only use we have for get. We won't really see it anywhere else. Okay, so let's work now. Let's look at our process page and see how do we work with the data that was in the form and maybe display back to the screen whatever we got from the user. So to do this, we're going to need to write server-side code. So if we want PHP code, what's the first thing I need to put on this page? Yeah, we need PHP tags, right? Opening and closing tag. So what we're going to do when we submit a form, PHP has a collection. It basically takes all of the input on that form and stores them in an array or in a collection. And there's one of two different collections we can use. One of them is called so our collections are either $_post or $_get, depending on which method we used in our form. So which one of these arrays are we going to use to get the values from our form? Does our form use post or get? Our form's using post, so we'll need to use the $_post array. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create 3 variables. And remember, PHP is loosely typed, so our variables have no data type, and we don't have to declare them before we use them. So I'll create a variable called first name, and all our PHP variables start with the $sign. My code editor recognizes when I type $underscore. So these are all the built-in collections with PHP. We've got a collection of cookies, which we're not really going to use. We have an environment collection, files. We're going to use that later in the semester. We want to be able to upload, for example, logos to our restaurants. We'll have to be able to process file uploads. So we'll use that files array. We've got get, post, and then request, server, and session. We'll use that later. We'll use some of those later. So we want the post array. And in here, we can either specify an index or we can specify the name of an input from our form. So what input name are we going to use? Here's our form. We got 3 inputs. Which value is going to go in here? Okay. We don't have to use variables for this. We can work with this value directly. But this is easier to type than this. There's less chance of errors because there's no underscore, brackets, quotes. So I find it's easier and less typing if we want to work with this value later. Easier to work with this than this. So now we want to just display this to the screen. So PHP has a strange command. We won't typically use a print or an output or a write command. It has this command called echo. Echo just means display HTML to the browser. So we'll start it. We'll just do it this way. If we load our form and fill it out and press submit now, we should see whatever we type in the first name box should now show up on our process form page. So let's try this out and then I'll show you all the different ways we can mess this up, which we will all do during the semester. So then we'll know what things to watch for and how to easily debug when we don't get the right input showing up on our processing page. So I don't need to reload this page because we haven't changed my form. I've just changed the process page. So if I click submit now, whatever's in the input box shows up on the next page. If I go back, just change that from Rich to R, it says R. So it's properly capturing whatever I'm typing in that input. There are a few common mistakes here. Here's one. We talked about the PHP's case sensitive. What's going to happen if I refresh now? What's going to be displayed on my screen? So it'll say, to reload this page, do you want to resubmit the form? So I do. I want to send the form data to the server again. So I'll click resend, or if you're in Chrome, it might say retry. I'll click that button. Now, how this behaves depends on the PHP settings of your web server. On XAMPP, it throws this error, right? First name all lowercase doesn't exist. So I get an error. Not all web servers are going to behave this way. I'm going to upload this to AWS. Just upload my changes here. And say always just overwrite. I'm going to go back here and refresh. Okay, so AWS works the same. Some web servers in PHP will allow this. It'll just print a blank. It'll say first name all lowercase, that has no value, and it'll just print nothing. So this is actually good that our server is crashing. Here's the other common mistake. We do this. So our input names are case sensitive, just like our variable name. On my form, I've used first name with a capital N. But in my processing, I'm looking for a post value all in lowercase. So let's see what happens in this case. Either we're going to get an error or we may just get nothing printed to the screen. So again, it's saying undefined index, first name all lowercase, it doesn't exist. That's not part of our post array. I guarantee you, every one of us in this room, including me, will make this mistake during the semester. We'll name an input one thing on our form, but then we'll try to refer to it by a different name, element name in our post array. And we'll get that undefined index. So if you ever see that error saying undefined index, it means that this value here doesn't match any of the input names on the form. One other thing to note, notice our input attributes, we have both a name and an ID attribute. How come we have both? And it's the same. So I've given them the same, first name, last name. Well, what's the difference between the name attribute and the ID attribute? We want to have them both, but they're used in different ways.
ID attribute is in order to link with the label. Because like if you want to add a full form,
yep,
we have to match for an ID.
Yeah. What else do we use the ID attribute of HTML elements for? For the label, you're right. Right. If we want to manipulate elements in the browser with client-side JavaScript, we're going to identify them by the ID tag. So basically think of it this way. The ID is for client-side interaction with that element. What about the name attribute? Right, the name, so PHP doesn't care about the IDs because PHP runs on the server. So PHP will identify these using the name attribute. So that's why I put both a name and an ID on all of my inputs. But PHP is concerned with these. If we take out the IDs, our PHP script will still run. But if we take out the name attributes, the PHP script will crash when it tries to process them. It ignores the IDs, it's interested in the name. So the best practice is use both name and ID on our inputs. We don't really need the IDs for this class, but it's just good practice to put them in. So I'm going to put them in. And we also want to try to be consistent with our names. So notice I use the same value for name and ID. And then over here, I gave a variable, again, with the same name. And if we were saving this to the database, we're not, but if we were, I'd put my column in the database. I'd, again, call it first name, spelt in the same way in camel case. So we don't want to have different names for the same value. We should name it the same thing consistently. So there's our first name. So it shows up. It shows up here. So let's capture and display both the last name and email. Should be relatively simple. We're just doing the same thing. So we'll have two more variables. Now you can use indexes. You can use 0, 1, and 2. I don't recommend it because if you move any element on the form to a different position, all of the numbers are now in a different sequence. So it's probably better to use the names for the elements in the array rather than numbers. So we'll do last name. This will capture all three values. We can print them all out. Just copying what I've already done with first name, we'll copy that for our other two values. And now if we resubmit our form, it should show us all three: first name, last name, email. Whatever's entered in the form, this page will spit out. If I just refresh, doesn't look so good, but it's working. Right? There's our output when we do it this way. So let's see how we fix this. Maybe we want the first name and the last name to appear together with a space, and then we want the email to be on the next line below. So in that case, we want to include some HTML formatting here. So let's look at how we can do this. Now, for the most part in PHP, there's no difference between using single quotes and double quotes. There's one big exception, and the exception is if we want to enclose variables. So let's look at how this looks. I'll just do it this way first so you can see the difference. I'm going to put first name, double quotes. I'm going to put last name in single quotes. Now let's refresh this again so that we can see they're not going to behave the same way. I'll resubmit my form. So this is what we got. What's the difference between single quotes and double quotes when we're using variable names in PHP for display? The echo command. Which one reads the variable name, double quotes or single quotes? Double quotes incorrectly interprets the variable, right? Because my first name showed up. There's my first name. That's the part in double quotes. But in single quotes, the variable gets treated like a literal string, right? It doesn't get translated from my variable. So often when we can, if we just want to display a variable, we can use double quotes. It's a little bit simpler. But we also want a line break. So we'll do this a little differently. So we'll do first name, and then a space. Keep this line out. We don't need that line because double quotes will translate the variables. How do we include? There's a few different ways. We also want a line break, an HTML BR tag. So how can we put this in? Where should it go? So it's first name, space, last name, and then we want the email on a new line down below. Sorry? So we could actually do it right here. After our last name variable, we can put in just HTML. So this should then give us a line return, and our email should now go below. I'll resubmit one more time. Okay. What did I do wrong? It mostly worked. It gave me the first name and the email. Why is it giving me this? Undefined variable last name. What's wrong with my code? And my code editor gives me a hint, right? It's in yellow. Yeah, right? Even when I mouse over it, it says unresolved variable. It doesn't know what that is because I forgot the camel case. Notice now that yellow background color goes away. So our code editor is going to help us find some of these problems if we pay attention to the color coding and highlighting. Resend one more time. Now we're good. If I upload this to AWS, it should work there as well. I'll just re-upload my process page and try it here too. Right, so it's working in both locally and live. Now it's about time for us to take lunch break. You guys probably hungry. Are there any questions for anybody before we take a break? Make sense so far what we're doing? So what we're going to do after we come back is we're going to kind of go through this process again. You're going to get really comfortable building forms and submitting them because we're going to do it almost every week. So it's going to become second nature. We're going to add this piece in. So how do we take this data and rather than just display it on the screen what the user entered, how do we actually save it in a database so that we have it stored permanently? So we can start adding restaurants and we're going to have that list of restaurants in our database that we can work with every week. Okay, so we will take a 20-minute break and we'll come back and we'll start on that at 12:35.